Hello, it's Dr. Stephanie, your favorite life coach and physician, and I just have a question for you. Do you believe the bias? I think that this is a very appropriate time. If you're in the United States, we're going through election season. And so that word bias is being thrown around a lot. But I just want to bring something to our awareness, and that is the question: do you believe the bias? Now, this has a lot of layers to it, and this is something that I have to ask myself a lot. Now, if we just start with a basic definition of bias, a bias is pretty much a prejudice that we have either against or for a certain group. But the issue is, a lot of the times we have unconscious or implicit bias. We don't even know where that bias came from because it was formed before we were conscious of the fact that it's formed. Now, we might be aware that we have that bias now, so it doesn't feel unconscious. But what makes it unconscious is the fact that it was formed before we were consciously aware. It was passed down through things that we heard or things that we were told, or a gut instinct, or propaganda, or the media, or whatever. But we sort of accepted certain characteristics about a group of people that may or may not be true. It's not necessarily based in fact, it's a bias or a thought or a belief. And we're human. Our brains will naturally group people together to make sense of our world so that we can save some brain power. We got a lot to do, we have a lot of thinking to do, and if we can fire some shortcuts, then our brains are naturally wired to fire shortcuts. But do you know that a lot of the biases that you may unconsciously hold are not serving you well? Honestly, you have some biases probably against yourself. There may be some unconscious biases, thoughts and prejudices or stereotypes, positive or negative, that were formed without you actually having facts that you accept about yourself. Now, it may be because other people have placed those biases on you, have treated you in a certain way because of their own biases and stereotypes. I'll give you a perfect example. I introduce myself as your favorite life coach and physician. So I do still do some doctoring. And when I do doctoring, I work in urgent care. And I had an urgent care shift just last week. And where I work, there are physicians who work as providers, nurse practitioners, and physician's assistants. I'm kind of old school, right? I've been a doctor for a long time. So the way I was raised up in medicine, if you were a doctor, you were addressed by your title, Dr. Brown. So when I come in, I introduce myself as Dr. Brown. And as the shift progressed, I noticed that one of the staff members I was working with kept calling me Stephanie. I've learned not to, take any offense. That's just what they're most comfortable with calling me. If I feel like it's done in a disrespectful manner, I will correct them. But I didn't feel this was done in a disrespectful manner. But then she caught herself and she said, oh, are you a doctor? And she said, oh my gosh, you just look too young to be a doctor. Actually, I've been a doctor for over 30 years and I take that as a compliment, but I know I don't look too young to be a doctor. I definitely am old enough at this point in my career that I could be a doctor or MP or a PA. But I introduced myself as doctor, and it was her unconscious bias, whether it was because of my age or because of my appearance or because of my demeanor, whatever it was, that unconscious bias kicked in and automatically had her call me Stephanie instead of Dr. Brown, which is what I introduced myself to. And that's just an example. Because it's unconscious, it works on a level that we're not even aware. But what I want you to know is that my life's work is about us bringing things from the unconscious into the conscious. Because when things come from the unconscious into the conscious, that's when we have power. We have the power to decide, okay, is this a correct belief based on facts, or is this a bias Do I want to hold on to this belief or do I not? Because it can hurt us. It can hurt us if we absorb the bias of other people. It can hurt us if we turn those biases on ourselves. And it can hurt us if we use our unconscious bias against other people before we even know what they're about. It can cut us off from community. It can cut us off from relationships. It can hinder our success and it can hinder their success. And I'm going to explain why. And that's what I want to talk about this entire month. Why unconscious and implicit bias that goes unchecked can hinder us. Now, I know you're probably thinking, wait a minute. Sometimes the bias is correct. And you're right. Sometimes the bias is correct. But do you take the time to ask yourself, is the bias correct? A famous woman used to say, when someone shows you who they are, believe them. And listen to that. It's not when you think someone is a certain way, believe that. It's not if someone appears to be a part of a group which you know tend to act this way, put them in that group and believe that. No, the statement is when someone shows you who they are, believe them. Because that is not based on bias. That's based on truth, fact, and experience. And I believe that if we move more towards allowing people to show us who they are and then believing them versus us assuming who they are based on some bias that we picked up a long time ago, we don't even know where we picked it up because it's unconscious. Same thing with us. We get to show people who we are. If they come to us with bias, stereotypes, and prejudice, that's a them problem. That's not a us problem. Our job is to show them who we are. And if we have to break down their unconscious bias and bring it to their awareness, we'll be in a much better position to do that for others once we've done it for ourselves. So I think in this season of embracing unity, of understanding people who may be different than us, of trying to work together for a common good, this is the perfect time to figure out what our own unconscious biases are and to dismantle them so that we're dealing with each other, we're dealing with other people that we don't know based on what they've shown us. Let them show us who they are. Let us not assume, let us not base it on somebody else's actions of someone who was similar to them. And I just want to mention that there's so many different forms of bias that are unconscious. One of the main forms of bias that's unconscious is confirmation bias, right? We have a bias, someone does something, and we see that as a confirmation of the bias that we already had. That's one of the ones that plagues us. There's gender bias. There's ageism. We've seen that play out on the political landscape too recently, haven't we? The gender and the age. There's beauty bias. There's conformity bias. There's even affinity bias. And I will admit, I'm talking to probably mostly Black women because I have an affinity for Black women. That's the group that I belong with. That's the group that I feel most comfortable with. And so sometimes there's an affinity bias. And that's one of the ones that I have to be aware of when I am in a group of Black women and when I'm not in a group of Black women. There's name bias. Sometimes people are biased against you just because of your name. Hello? Has everybody gotten the exercise on how to pronounce Kamala? There's name bias. There is attribution bias. We attribute certain things to certain people. And this month I'm going to go into all of the different ways that there's unconscious bias can show up, either within ourselves or within other people. So I'm excited. I think that this is a timely topic, and I look forward to us learning and growing from each other this month. All right. Take care. Bye-bye.